So you mentioned in terms of prevention, metabolically healthy. Is there anything you're excited about or would like to underscore that relates to developing metabolic health or improving metabolic health?
Always. I'd say, exercise is so important, right? It can't be overstated. It's potentially one of the most potent drugs we have.
But all exercise is not created equal, I would imagine.
Correct.
For this purpose.
Absolutely. And so I think of exercise as having 4 pillars. And you have to be strong on each of those. So if you're strong in 3 but not in 1, it's sort of like a table that has 3 legs and not 1. It's still a reasonable table, but it's not as strong as a table with 4 legs. And a table with 2 legs is pretty pathetic. And obviously a table with 1 leg is not a table. So the 4 pillars are stability, strength, aerobic efficiency, and anaerobic performance. And I think that most people understand loosely what 3 of those are.
Could you say those all one more time?
Sure. Stability.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one that most people don't understand. We can talk about that in a minute. Strength, aerobic efficiency, and anaerobic performance. So I guess we can unpack all of them, but stability is the ability to safely transfer load from the outside world to the body and vice versa, which sounds sort of like kind of a soft explanation. An analogy that I really like using is that of a race car versus a street car. So what makes race cars so unique is that, and why, by the way, a race car that's got half the power of a street car will still knock its socks off on a track, is because the chassis and the tires of the race car are constructed in such a way that every bit of that power is making it to the road. So the analogy I like to think of is that the tires of a race car are like our feet, and stability really does begin with the feet. And most people, myself included, when I was starting, had horrible proprioception with our feet. We don't really know how to load our feet correctly. And a lot of that comes from the fact that we wear shoes all day. Your hands and your feet are actually very similar. And if you think about what you can do with your hands, how easily you can move them around, spread your fingers, sense pressure in different areas, most people can't do that with their feet. And that comes to bite you. So as you think about how it moves up the sort of chain, a very common problem is which I think accounts for probably more of the injuries that people experience, is this pattern where the pelvis is tilted forward, the ribs are flared up, the erector spinae muscles in the back are sort of locked short, meaning they're locked they're locked in concentric load, and the hamstrings are locked long, so they're locked in eccentric load.
Yeah. It's how someone who's quite lean from a body fat perspective can still look like they have a pot belly.
That's right.
With that anterior pelvic tilt.
Which actually, so you've asked me a question, and I think that I can answer this with, there are really 2 things I'm excited about that pertain to exercise. And I'll go down this path and then we'll come back to the other one. So what's the etiology of that position, which I was the king of that position? It's probably...
What do you mean by etiology?
Like what drives that? Why would a person show up with that posture of ribs flared up, pelvis tilted forward, back tight, hamstrings tight and long?
Besides wearing 6-inch stiletto heels.
Yeah, which I never wore. I mean, I wore them sometimes, but I don't often wear them.
You're in good company. J. Edgar Hoover and all. Continue.
So it probably starts with lousy respiration. And I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but I think somewhere along the way, we stopped learning, or we stopped breathing correctly into our abdomen, right? So instead of breathing the way we should breathe, which is the diaphragm should go down, the abdomen should come out, the pelvis should actually fill with pressure. We tend to breathe using, those are the primary muscles of respiration, is the diaphragm. We start using accessory muscles like the pec and the pec minor, and we kind of lift the chest up. This is a very common pattern of respiration. And I think it's that lifting of the chest that is what's bringing the rib cage up. And when that happens, the body is a little bit out of balance, meaning your center of mass shifts forward. And the body senses that, and in an effort to prevent you from falling forward, it's basically tightening those erector spinae muscles. It's pulling you into balance again. But in doing so, it's creating this downstream problem in the hamstrings, which is they're locking. And if there's another thing I've become really obsessed with, it's hamstring control, which is different from hamstring strength. A lot of people, myself included, can have very strong hamstrings. I used to have incredibly strong hamstrings if you put me on a machine and made me do something in isolation, but I could never recruit them. So a simple exercise to demonstrate this, which Beth Lewis had me do for the first time maybe 2.5 or 3 years ago, was laying on your back with your knees up and your feet down. So you're sort of in a back position, knees up, feet on the surface of the ground. And without letting your back tilt into a huge, make a huge dome underneath it. So while keeping your lower back flat, can you, with one leg, pull very, very hard back to your butt and feel your hamstring tense? So that is a very specific manner of recruiting hamstring strength. And believe it or not, I couldn't do that while keeping my back down. My back, I would arch like a cat if I tried to do that. There were many more of these types of exercises, but it was through this type of very deliberate, starting on my back and then learning to do hamstring recruitment while standing and while feeling pressure in my feet that really allowed me to get back to deadlifting with a feeling of safety that I'd never really experienced, because I used to deadlift so heavy when I was young and basically got away with using my back to deadlift, which is obviously not what you want to do. And then I just started having nagging injuries as I got older. So by the time I was in my mid 40s, I'm deadlifting and it's like, my SI joint would bug me. And after I'd finish, my back would just feel tight. So it's sort of, what age sort of exposes your deficiencies. And eventually everybody's going to sort of pay a price for this. Some people do these things naturally better than others. So I think there are some people who can kind of go their entire life lifting heavy weights without having to pay much attention to this stuff. But, I certainly wasn't one of them.
Does that type of training that you're describing, that progression, kind of starting back from the foundation or the fundamentals, does that have a particular name?
There are a couple different schools of thought that have been implemented into this training. One of them being dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, or DNS, which is heavily focused on this ability to find the breath and generate, this concentric abdominal pressure. So creating a cylinder inside the abdomen, as opposed to like an upside down triangle where you have some pressure up here, but none down here. And then another school of thought that's been heavily influential here has been something called Postural Restoration Institute, or PRI. And that's really the one that has focused on this idea of how do you correct what from the side looks like this, right? Sort of pelvis down, ribs up, and how do you fix that position? And again, it's hard because it requires fixing everything from the feet to the neck.
How much of a contributor, if at all, do you think extended sitting is to that configuration with the kind of flared ribs up and anterior pelvic tilt, if any?
I think it probably is, and probably for a couple of reasons. You have to sort of think about it as the positive and the negative, right? So one drawback of sitting is that you're not active. So it's simply the removal of active time that is a problem. And I think the other problem with sitting is it is simply harder to generate intra-abdominal pressure, and it's easier to just rely on these accessory movements of respiration to lift up. So, I think I've said this once before, like if I could be czar for a day, I'd go back to kids when they're in school and, have them in standing desks or squatting. Those would be your two positions, right? So you're kind of squatting to do work or you're standing to do work, but you're not sitting in the types of chairs that we sit in.
I think I have an idea for a complimentary short form podcast for you, which is just called Czar for a Day. 5 minute commandments from Czar Attia.
Yep. And more barefoot time. That's another thing, right? With my first two kids, I wasn't so aware of this when they were young. And now with my youngest, who's almost 4, like I study this guy like he's like the master. His movement patterns are simply unbelievable, which of course all 4-year-olds should be. I just never noticed it before. But the manner in which he moves and lifts himself and reaches for things and sits around, it's incredible. It is such a spectacle to behold. So, if you spend more time watching your children, and that's, DNS is modeled on exactly that, right? DNS basically says it grew out of something called the Prague School in Czechoslovakia, which was originally looking at ways to take children with cerebral palsy and teach them how to move again by realizing that what CP had robbed them of was a lot of the developmental movement patterns that occur in the first 2 years of life. And once they started to realize you could actually take these kids and retrain their neurologic system to do things in a more functional way, that you could actually do this as a form of rehab and then ultimately a form of prehab, which is sort of how I like to think of it now. So
I've seen, I don't know how much of this is public, but incredible results from a trainer, also world record holder or former world record holder in Olympic weightlifting, Jerzy Gregorek, working with a number of clients or patients with cerebral palsy using very incremental movement rehabilitation and training. I mean, the before and after differences are staggering, and it's. I mean, it speaks to probably my ignorance of cerebral palsy, but just never was even within my conceptual schema that would be possible. It's very exciting to see. So, speaking of exciting.
Oh, so the other thing on exercise, to get back to your question about the metabolic stuff, is, about 3 years ago, I was becoming more and more interested in this idea of zone 2 training, which has a very technical definition, and then we can explain proxies for it. But the definition of zone 2 is the highest level of output you can produce while keeping lactate below 2 millimole. So lactate is a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism. So when we're sitting here at rest, our lactate level is probably 1 if we're metabolically healthy. There are some people who sit around at rest higher than 2. But if anybody's done lactate testing knows, as you start exerting yourself more and more, your lactate will rise. And, peak levels in highly trained individuals can reach above 20 millimole. And that's accompanied by remarkable discomfort, actually. So I've always done lactate training when I was, being an athlete, which I haven't been in forever. But I was never focused on this aspect of it. I was always focused on something called lactate threshold and peak lactate. So peak lactate for me was kind of a marker of just how much pain I could endure. And lactate threshold was a marker of the highest amount of output I could produce for relatively short races. Meaning short for me would be like half an hour or something like that. So knowing my lactate threshold was important for that stuff. But this zone 2 stuff is way below that, right? Zone 2 is by definition your all-day pace. It's basically at a lactate level of 2, you should be able to go all day, because that's the level at which you do not net accumulate. So you're producing, but you're not accumulating. And so it's the rate at which clearance equals production, and you stay at that level of 2.
So does that training fall into the aerobic efficiency category?
Yes, exactly.